It was a warm Friday evening, and the city was alive with lights, laughter, and the constant hum of traffic. People were pouring into restaurants after a long week of work, and one particular rooftop restaurant was buzzing with energy. Emily, a young waitress in her early 20s, tied her apron and adjusted the small notepad she always carried. She had been working at the restaurant for almost 2 years, and though the job was tiring, she found comfort in its rhythm. The clinking of glasses, the smell of freshly cooked meals, and the soft music in the background had become part of her daily life. Emily had grown used to the ups and downs of serving people. Some customers were polite and kind, while others treated waiters like invisible shadows. She had learned to smile, no matter what, but inside she often wished people could see that waiters, too, had stories, dreams, and feelings. Tonight, though, she was determined to stay positive. Her manager had reminded her that Fridays were always the busiest, and she had prepared herself for a long night. The restaurant itself was something special. It sat on the top floor of a tall building and had glass walls that opened onto a terrace. From there, diners could see the skyline lit up with glittering towers. Couples often came here for romantic dinners, and business people held meetings over wine. Emily always admired the view, though she rarely had the chance to stop and look at it properly. Most of her time was spent carrying trays, checking orders, and making sure customers were satisfied. As the evening began, Emily moved quickly from one table to another. She welcomed guests with a friendly smile, recommended dishes, and jotted down their choices with practiced ease. She knew how important first impressions were in this line of work. A warm smile and polite words could turn even the grumpiest guest into a happy customer. She enjoyed watching people as she worked. At one table, a young couple held hands, whispering to each other and laughing softly. At another, a family of 4 shared plates of food, their children giggling as they tried to eat spaghetti. It reminded her of her own family dinners back home, though those times had become rare since she moved to the city for this job. Behind the scenes, the kitchen was in full swing. The chefs called out orders, the sound of sizzling pans filled the air, and the aroma of grilled meat and fresh herbs spread everywhere. Emily often peeked inside the kitchen and admired the teamwork there, everyone moving quickly yet carefully, like a well-practiced orchestra. She respected their dedication, just as she hoped people respected her role as a waitress. By 7:30 p.m., the place was almost full. Emily carried 3 plates at once to a large table of friends celebrating a birthday. They cheered when she arrived, and she couldn't help but laugh with them. Moments like these made her love her job, seeing strangers come together and share happiness. She felt proud to be part of their memories, even if only in small ways. Still, being a waitress wasn't easy. Her feet already ached, and she knew she had hours left before the night ended. Sometimes, she wondered if people realized how hard waiters worked. They didn't just take orders and deliver food, they juggled countless tasks at once, remembered details, solved problems, and stayed polite no matter what. Emily often reminded herself that patience was her biggest strength. As the night grew busier, her manager gave her a small nod of approval. He trusted Emily because she handled pressure better than most. Some new waiters panicked when orders piled up, but Emily had learned to breathe, focus, and keep moving. She believed every shift was like a test of character, one she was determined to pass. She wiped a table clean, placed fresh cutlery, and checked the wine glasses for spots. Details mattered in this restaurant. Customers were paying for more than food, they were paying for an experience. Emily knew that one careless mistake could ruin someone's evening, so she gave her best in every little thing. Though the restaurant looked elegant, the truth behind it was hard work, sweat, and countless small sacrifices. Emily sometimes dreamed of a different life, maybe working in an office or owning her own cafe. But for now, this rooftop place was her world. It gave her a chance to meet people from all walks of life, travelers, businessmen, artists, and even the occasional celebrity. Every night brought a new story, and she was curious about what this night might hold. She noticed a group of wealthy-looking men entering the restaurant. Their suits were sharp, their watches expensive, and they carried an air of importance. She didn't think much of it at first, this place often welcomed rich guests. She simply greeted them politely and led them to their table near the terrace. Little did she know that one of these men would soon test her patience in ways she had never experienced before. For now, though, the evening still felt ordinary. She continued her routine, moving gracefully through the tables, balancing trays, and sharing polite conversations with guests. The warm lights above created a cozy glow, and the night breeze flowed in from the terrace, carrying with it the distant sound of the city. Emily felt calm despite the rush, unaware that the quiet strength she carried inside her would soon be tested in front of everyone. This was just the beginning of her shift, a shift that seemed no different from the many she had worked before. But sometimes, life hides its biggest surprises in ordinary moments. Emily had no idea that the events of this single evening would change her life forever, all because of one rude billionaire who was about to walk into her world. The rooftop restaurant was glowing with life that evening. Soft music played in the background, the laughter of guests mixed with the sound of glasses clinking, and the aroma of freshly cooked meals filled the air. Everything seemed smooth, until a new guest walked in, a man who would soon disturb the peace of the entire place. His name was Jason, a young billionaire in his late 20s. Jason was tall, sharply dressed in a designer suit, and wore an expensive watch that glittered under the lights. Anyone who looked at him could tell he was rich. He walked in with 3 friends, each one just as loud and arrogant as the other. Their voices carried across the restaurant, disturbing the quiet atmosphere people had come to enjoy. Some customers turned their heads, a little annoyed, but Jason didn't seem to care. He carried himself as if he owned not only the restaurant but the whole building. Emily noticed them immediately. She had served all kinds of people before, but there was something about Jason's confidence that felt different. It wasn't the confidence of a kind leader or a successful man, it was the confidence of someone who thought the world owed him everything. Still, Emily smiled politely and greeted him like she greeted every customer. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" she asked with warmth in her voice. Jason didn't even look at her at first. Instead, he snapped his fingers, signaling for his friends to follow him. After a few seconds, he finally glanced at Emily, smirking. "Reservation? Do I look like someone who needs a reservation?" he said loudly enough for people at nearby tables to hear. His friends chuckled, and Emily felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. But she kept her composure. With a calm voice, she explained that the restaurant was full and that she needed to know their booking. Jason waved his hand dismissively. "Call your manager. Tell him Jason Miller is here. He knows who I am," he said, as if his name alone should open doors. Emily nodded politely and led him to a table by the terrace, one of the best spots in the restaurant. She had a feeling that refusing him would create more problems than solving them. The moment Jason sat down, his behavior grew worse. He leaned back in his chair, speaking loudly, and demanded the most expensive wine without even looking at the menu. When Emily gently asked if he'd like to see the wine list, he scoffed. "I don't read lists. Just bring me the best bottle you have. And make it quick," he ordered, snapping his fingers again like she was a servant rather than a waitress. Emily forced a smile and walked to the bar, but inside, she was unsettled. She had served rich customers before, but Jason's arrogance was beyond anything she had seen. He treated her not as a person, but as if she were invisible, a tool to bring him what he wanted. When she returned with the wine, Jason barely acknowledged her. He kept talking loudly to his friends, bragging about his wealth, his cars, his travels, and the deals he had closed. "I just bought a yacht last week," he said proudly. "Cost me 20 million, but what's 20 million? Pocket change." His friends laughed as if every word he spoke was pure gold. Emily placed the wine carefully on the table, but Jason immediately criticized her. "Took you long enough. What were you doing, making the wine yourself?" he said sarcastically. His friends roared with laughter again. Emily felt a sting in her heart, but she held her head high. She had promised herself never to let rude customers break her spirit. The evening continued, and Jason only became more unbearable. He clicked his fingers whenever he wanted something, interrupted Emily while she was speaking, and even made insulting comments about her job. "Do you actually enjoy waiting tables?" he asked mockingly at one point. "Or is this just the only thing you could get? Don't worry, maybe if you're lucky, someone rich will rescue you from this life." The words cut deep, But Emily simply smiled politely and walked away. She reminded herself that dignity wasn't about how others treated you, but how you chose to respond. Still, she couldn't help but notice how his words created a tense atmosphere. Other diners whispered quietly, throwing disapproving glances at Jason's table. Things became worse when Jason turned his attention toward one of Emily's co-workers, a young waiter named Daniel, who was still new to the job. Daniel nervously placed dishes on their table, but his hands shook slightly from the pressure. Jason noticed and immediately pounced. "Look at this!" Jason exclaimed loudly. "The boy can't even hold a plate properly. Did you hire him from the street? What kind of restaurant is this?" Daniel's face turned red, and Emily saw the embarrassment in his eyes. That was the moment something shifted inside her. She had tolerated Jason's arrogance toward herself, but seeing him humiliate her coworker in front of everyone felt unbearable. Emily clenched her fists but kept her composure for the moment, watching closely as Jason continued to make cruel jokes at Daniel's expense. The night was no longer ordinary. The peaceful rooftop restaurant, once filled with laughter and quiet joy, now carried a heavy tension. Guests at nearby tables were whispering and shaking their heads. Even Emily's manager looked worried, unsure whether to step in. But deep down, Emily knew something had to be done. Jason's behavior was crossing a line, and someone had to stand up not just for the dignity of the staff, but for the respect of everyone in the restaurant. Jason, however, was completely unaware of the storm he was creating. To him, this was just another evening where he could show off, insult people, and laugh without consequences. He leaned back, raised his glass of wine, and smirked at Emily as if daring her to challenge him. What he didn't realize was that the young waitress standing before him was not weak. Emily might have been serving tables, but inside her was a strength he could not buy with all his billions. And soon, she was going to prove it. Jason's laughter echoed through the rooftop restaurant, loud enough to make heads turn. His friends joined in, smirking at every cruel joke he made about the staff. To him, this was entertainment, belittling others to feel powerful. But to everyone else, it was uncomfortable, almost unbearable. The once cheerful atmosphere of the restaurant now carried a sharp tension, and no one could relax. Emily stood near the bar, holding her notepad tightly in her hand. Her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a storm of emotions she tried to keep under control. She had dealt with rude customers before, but Jason was different. His arrogance wasn't just personal, it was targeted at everyone around him. And now, seeing her coworker Daniel humiliated in front of strangers, Emily felt something heavy rise inside her. It wasn't anger alone. It was a sense of justice. Daniel tried to continue serving the table, his hands trembling as he placed another dish down. Jason leaned forward and sneered. "Careful, boy. Don't drop it." "Oh wait, maybe you should, so at least you'll give us some entertainment," he mocked. His friends burst into laughter, clapping like children enjoying a cruel performance. Daniel's face turned pale, and he quickly lowered his eyes, pretending not to hear. Emily couldn't stand it anymore. She stepped forward and placed herself between Daniel and Jason's table. With a steady voice, she said, "That's enough, sir." Her words weren't loud, but the firmness in her tone caught Jason's attention immediately. The laughter at the table died down. Jason raised an eyebrow and looked at her, amused. "Excuse me," he asked, as if he couldn't believe a waitress had dared to speak back to him. Emily held his gaze, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. "You've been insulting my staff and disrupting the other customers. I must ask you to stop." The restaurant fell into silence. Guests at nearby tables leaned closer, curious to see what would happen next. Emily's manager, standing near the kitchen door, froze, his mouth slightly open, unsure if he should intervene. Everyone knew Jason was rich and powerful. Most people would bow down to him out of fear. But Emily didn't. Jason chuckled, shaking his head slowly as if she were a child scolding an adult. "Do you even know who I am?" he asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I could buy this entire place tomorrow if I wanted to. You think your little speech matters to me?" Emily took a small breath and answered calmly, "It doesn't matter who you are. Respect is for everyone. And if you can't show it, then you don't belong here." Gasps spread across the room. Some customers covered their mouths, others exchanged wide-eyed looks. Jason's friends stopped laughing, unsure how to react. They weren't used to seeing anyone stand up to Jason, especially not a waitress. For a moment, Jason was speechless. His face hardened, his jaw tightening. Then, with a sarcastic laugh, he leaned back in his chair. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But you're also making a big mistake. People like me, people with power, we don't get thrown out of places. We own them. And people like you serve us." Emily's hands trembled slightly, but she refused to back down. "Not tonight," she said firmly. "Not here. You've crossed the line, and I need you to leave." Her words carried weight. They weren't shouted, they weren't harsh, but they were final. And somehow, that made them even more powerful. Jason slammed his hand on the table, making glasses rattle. "You're going to regret this," he hissed. But Emily didn't flinch. She simply gestured toward the exit. The restaurant staff, who had been frozen until now, quietly stepped closer, ready to support her. Even the manager, though nervous, gave a slight nod, silently standing behind Emily. Jason's friends shifted uncomfortably. They had come to enjoy a fun night, but now all eyes in the restaurant were on them. The applause of earlier conversations had turned into whispers of disapproval. For the first time, Jason wasn't the one in control, Emily was. Slowly, Jason stood up, straightening his expensive suit. He gave Emily a long, cold stare, as though trying to intimidate her. But she didn't look away. He leaned close, his voice low but sharp. "You'll regret this for the rest of your life," he muttered. Emily didn't move. "Maybe," she replied softly, "but at least I'll know I did the right thing." Her words hit him harder than she expected. For a second, Jason looked almost stunned. Then he smirked, masking his frustration, and motioned for his friends to follow him. Together, they walked toward the exit, their expensive shoes tapping loudly against the floor. The door shut behind them with a heavy thud, and the tension in the restaurant broke like a storm finally passing. There was silence for a heartbeat, and then applause. Customers began clapping, some even cheering softly. Daniel, still pale and shaken, looked at Emily with gratitude in his eyes. Her manager, though clearly nervous about what consequences might follow, gave her a subtle nod of approval. Emily felt her chest rise with relief. She had stood up not just for herself, but for every staff member who had ever been treated poorly. But as the applause faded and the restaurant returned to its normal rhythm, Emily's thoughts began to wander. Had she gone too far? Jason was no ordinary customer, he was a billionaire, someone with influence and connections. What if he complained to the owner? What if she lost her job? Yet, deep down, Emily felt no regret. Respect mattered more than money, and she had shown everyone that dignity could not be bought. Still, as she returned to serving tables, a shadow of worry lingered in her mind. She had no idea what Jason might do next, or how far his anger would go. And she certainly didn't know that her act of courage would soon draw the attention of someone far more powerful than Jason, a man who was already on his way, arriving in the most unexpected way possible. The door of the rooftop restaurant closed behind Jason with a heavy thud, and for a moment, silence hung in the air. Everyone had just witnessed something they had never expected, a waitress standing up to a billionaire and sending him out of the restaurant. It was the kind of scene people would normally see in movies, not real life. Emily stood still, her heart beating so fast it felt like it might burst. She had faced Jason's cold stare and harsh words, but she hadn't backed down. She didn't know where that courage had come from, it just rose up inside her, stronger than her fear. Now that the confrontation was over, she felt her hands trembling. She quickly tucked them into her apron so no one would notice. The sound of clapping began softly, then grew louder. Customers from nearby tables applauded her bravery. Some smiled at her, some even whispered, "Good job," or "That was amazing." For a brief moment, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone, others had seen Jason's behavior, and they agreed with her decision. Daniel, the young waiter Jason had mocked earlier, came up beside her. His eyes were wide, and his face still red, but there was a look of admiration shining in them. "Thank you, Emily," he whispered. I didn't know what to do." Emily gave him a small smile. You don't need to thank me. No one should treat you like that, she replied. Her voice was gentle, but inside, her emotions were still swirling. She felt proud, yes, but also anxious. Jason's final words replayed in her mind, "You'll regret this for the rest of your life." Her manager approached next. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes, but tonight those eyes were filled with worry. "Emily," he said softly, pulling her a little aside, "you know who that was, right?" She nodded. "Yes. Jason Miller." He made sure everyone knew his name. The manager rubbed his forehead. "He's powerful, Emily. His family has connections everywhere. I admire what you did, truly, but I'm worried. If he decides to complain, the owner might not side with us. They don't like trouble." Emily swallowed hard. She knew he was right. In the world she lived in, money often spoke louder than fairness. Still, she straightened her shoulders and said, "If I lose this job for doing the right thing, then so be it. At least I won't feel ashamed of myself." The manager sighed but gave her a small pat on the shoulder. "You have more courage than most of us. Let's hope this doesn't come back to bite us." As the night went on, the restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Waiters served food, glasses clinked, and conversations resumed, but the memory of what had happened still lingered in the air. Guests occasionally looked at Emily, whispering about how fearless she had been. For once, a waitress had been the hero of the night. But Emily's mind wasn't at ease. As she walked from table to table, she couldn't shake the image of Jason's angry face. Billionaires like him weren't used to humiliation. He had stormed out, but that didn't mean it was over. She kept wondering what kind of revenge he might plan. Would he call the restaurant's owner? Would he post about it on social media, twisting the story? Would he send someone back to intimidate her? Her thoughts were interrupted when an elderly couple at one of the tables called her over. They had witnessed the whole scene, and the woman gently touched Emily's hand as she placed their tea on the table. "My dear," the woman said kindly, "you were so brave. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself. People like him think money gives them power over everyone. You showed him it doesn't." Emily smiled, her eyes softening. "Thank you. That means a lot," she said quietly. Their words gave her comfort, a reminder that not everyone bowed down to wealth. Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, Jason paced angrily near his expensive car. His friends stood awkwardly beside him, no longer laughing like they had inside. They weren't used to seeing Jason lose. He pulled out his phone, his face dark with rage. "She thinks she can humiliate me? A waitress? She has no idea who she's dealing with," he muttered. His friends exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. They knew better than to challenge him when he was angry. Back inside, Emily carried on with her work, trying to focus on her customers. Yet deep down, she felt that the night was far from over. Something was coming, something bigger than she could imagine. Around 9 p.m., as the last of the dinner crowd settled into their meals, a sudden hush fell over the restaurant. At first, Emily thought it was her imagination, but then she noticed people looking out toward the terrace. She followed their gaze and felt her stomach twist in surprise. Far in the distance, above the glittering city lights, a faint sound echoed whoop, whoop, whoop. At first, it was barely noticeable, but it grew louder with each passing second. People began to murmur, pointing toward the sky. Then, the source became clear. A helicopter, sleek and black, was approaching the building. Its flashing lights reflected on the glass windows, and the powerful wind from its blades sent napkins fluttering and glasses trembling. The entire restaurant turned to watch, excitement and shock spreading across the room. Helicopters weren't unusual in the city, but one landing near a restaurant? That was something extraordinary. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had a strange feeling she knew who it might be connected to. The helicopter descended slowly, the sound vibrating through the floor. Emily's apron strings whipped in the wind as she stood frozen, staring. Her co-workers rushed to the windows, whispering in amazement. Guests pulled out their phones to capture the moment, some even stepping onto the terrace for a better view. And then, as the helicopter touched down on the private landing pad beside the building, the door opened. Out stepped an older man, tall and dignified, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. His presence was commanding, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. Though he said nothing, the moment he appeared, people could sense his authority. Emily's heart raced as she realized exactly who he must be. Jason's father. The man whose name carried even more weight than his son's arrogance. He hadn't come quietly, and he hadn't come alone, he had arrived in a way that made the whole city notice. Emily stood rooted to the spot, her mind swirling with questions. Why was he here? Was it to punish her for humiliating his son? Or was it something else entirely? The helicopter's blades finally slowed down, their loud roar fading into the night sky. For a moment, all anyone could hear was the soft hum of the city below. The rooftop restaurant, which had been buzzing with excitement and whispers only moments before, now fell into an uneasy silence. People who had been filming on their phones lowered them, waiting to see what would happen next. The air felt heavy, like the pause before a storm. Emily stood frozen near the entrance of the terrace, her apron fluttering gently in the wind that still lingered from the helicopter's landing. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had seen Jason's arrogance, she had endured his insults, and she had taken the bold step of throwing him out. But now the situation felt much bigger than she had ever imagined. Billionaires didn't just storm out of restaurants, they came back with helicopters and powerful connections. And if this man truly was Jason's father, she knew she might be standing at the edge of a life-changing moment. The older man who stepped out of the helicopter walked with calm confidence. His shoes clicked against the landing pad, his suit sharp, and his expression unreadable. He wasn't like Jason, who flaunted his wealth loudly. This man didn't need to show off, his presence alone commanded respect. People who had been whispering a moment ago grew silent, almost holding their breath. Even Emily's manager, who had been so worried earlier, now stood stiff and pale, his hands nervously tugging at the sleeves of his jacket. Jason himself stood near the helicopter, his arms crossed and his face twisted in anger. He had called his father, hoping to embarrass Emily, maybe even get her fired on the spot. Now he smirked, glancing at Emily with eyes that seemed to say, "This is the end for you." Emily felt the weight of those stares. Doubt crept into her chest like a cold shadow. Had she made a terrible mistake? What if Jason's father demanded that she be punished? What if she lost her job, her income, everything she had worked for? She thought of the rent she had to pay, the bills waiting at home, the little savings she kept aside for emergencies. Fear squeezed at her heart. The restaurant staff gathered near the entrance, whispering quietly. Daniel, the young waiter Jason had mocked earlier, looked at Emily with wide, anxious eyes. He wanted to say something, maybe words of encouragement, but he stayed quiet, sensing that silence was safer right now. Everyone was watching, everyone was waiting. The older man finally reached the terrace, his sharp eyes scanning the restaurant. The silence grew heavier with each step he took. Customers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. A woman clasped her husband's hand tightly. A group of businessmen who had been laughing earlier now sat stiff and straight, as if preparing for some important announcement. Emily's breath caught in her throat when his gaze finally landed on her. It wasn't an angry look, nor was it gentle. It was measuring. As though he was trying to see past her uniform, past her nervous stance, into the person she truly was. She wanted to look away, but something inside her told her not to. She lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze even though her knees felt weak. Jason broke the silence first. He stepped forward quickly, his voice loud and impatient. "Father, there she is," he said, pointing at Emily. "That's the waitress who humiliated me in front of everyone. She threw me out like some beggar. Can you believe that? Me, Jason Miller." His voice cracked with fury. "You need to show her who we are. Fire her. Shut this place down if you have to. She needs to pay for disrespecting us." Gasps spread through the restaurant at his words. Guests exchanged nervous glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The arrogance of Jason's demand was almost unbelievable, but no one dared to speak. All eyes turned back to the father, waiting for his response. But the older man said nothing. He didn't even look at Jason. Instead, he kept his gaze on Emily, as though Jason's shouting didn't exist. The silence stretched on, so heavy that Emily could hear the faint sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. Seconds felt like minutes. Her mind raced. Should she apologize? Should she defend herself? Or should she stay quiet, like the rest of the restaurant? 100 thoughts battled inside her, but her instincts told her one thing: stand firm. She had done nothing wrong. She had stood up against cruelty. And even though fear wrapped around her, she refused to lower her eyes. Jason's voice grew louder, more desperate. Father, why are you just standing there? Do something. She embarrassed me in front of everyone. You can't just let this slide. His words echoed, but still his father didn't respond. The older man's silence was more powerful than Jason's shouting. It was as if he was letting the weight of the moment settle before he spoke. Finally, the man took a step closer to Emily. The room seemed to shrink. People leaned forward in their seats, barely breathing. Emily tightened her grip on her notepad, the paper edges digging into her fingers. But before he could speak, something unexpected happened. A child from one of the nearby tables whispered loudly to his mother, "Mom, she's the brave lady who told that rude man to leave." The innocent words carried across the silence, reaching more ears than the child intended. A few guests smiled faintly, others nodded. Slowly, like ripples in water, the mood began to shift. Emily felt her chest tighten, her emotions caught between fear and hope. She realized that even though she was alone in uniform, she wasn't truly alone. People had seen the truth. They had witnessed Jason's cruelty and her courage. And even if his father chose to side with his son, deep down, the room already knew who was right and who was wrong. Still, the silence stretched on. The father's face gave nothing away. His eyes flicked briefly toward Jason, who stood red-faced and furious, then back to Emily. The weight of that stare was almost unbearable. Emily's breath trembled, but she didn't move. It was a silence filled with uncertainty, a silence that carried both fear and possibility. Nobody knew what was about to happen next. Would Jason's father unleash his power to crush her? Or would he surprise everyone with a different response? As Emily stood there, frozen in that heavy stillness, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was standing on a knife's edge. Whatever words left the older man's mouth next would change everything. The steady thump of the helicopter's blades still echoed faintly in the air, even as it rested silently on the rooftop landing pad. The glowing city lights flickered in the background, but all eyes were fixed on the tall, silver-haired man who had just stepped out. His presence seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. Guests leaned forward, waiters stood frozen, and Emily's breath caught in her chest. He walked with calm steps, his shoes clicking against the polished floor, each sound sharp in the silence. This was not a man who needed to raise his voice to be heard. His presence alone was louder than Jason's shouting had ever been. Jason hurried to his father's side, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "Father, you saw what happened. This waitress humiliated me in front of everyone. She doesn't know who I am. You have to punish her. She made me look weak." His words spilled out quickly, like a child running to complain after losing a fight. But his father didn't respond. He didn't even look at Jason. Instead, his eyes swept across the restaurant, taking in the nervous staff, the curious guests, the half-finished meals on tables. Finally, his gaze settled on Emily. She felt her knees grow weak under that piercing stare, but she forced herself not to look away. Something deep inside her told her that showing fear now would only make things worse. The silence grew heavier, as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath. Emily's manager stood near the kitchen, sweat forming on his forehead. Daniel, the young waiter, clutched a tray so tightly his knuckles turned white. Guests whispered softly, but no one dared speak too loudly. Jason, frustrated by his father's quiet, raised his voice again. "Why are you staring at her? She's just a waitress. She disrespected me, your son. Are you really going to let her get away with this?" The older man finally moved. Slowly, he walked past Jason, heading directly toward Emily. Every step he took seemed to echo, and Emily's heart pounded harder with each one. She didn't know what to expect. Would he fire her on the spot? Would he threaten to shut down the restaurant? Her palms grew damp, and her notepad trembled when he stopped just a few feet away from her. The room was so quiet that Emily could hear her own shaky breath. He studied her face carefully, as if searching for something beyond what was visible. His eyes weren't cruel like Jason's, they were sharp, calculating, but not unkind. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and steady. "Did you really throw my son out of this restaurant?" he asked. Emily swallowed hard. "Yes, sir," she replied softly but firmly. "He was insulting the staff and disturbing the guests. I asked him to stop. He didn't. So I asked him to leave." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight of honesty. She didn't try to defend herself with excuses. She didn't tremble or beg. She simply told the truth. The man's lips curved slightly, almost like the ghost of a smile. He turned his head toward Jason, who stood glaring, arms crossed tightly. "And you think she should be punished for that?" he asked his son. "Of course," Jason snapped. "She embarrassed me. In front of everyone. You raised me to never accept disrespect, didn't you? She has to pay for this." For the first time, his father's expression hardened. He turned fully to face Jason, his voice sharp as steel. "No, Jason. I raised you to respect others. What I see tonight is not strength. It is arrogance. It is weakness disguised as power." Gasps rippled across the restaurant. Jason's jaw dropped, his confidence shattering in front of everyone. He had expected his father to defend him, to crush the young waitress who had dared to stand against him. But instead, his father's words struck him like a slap. Slightly in her hand. The older man looked back at Emily, his expression softening. "You showed courage," he said. "It takes strength to stand up against arrogance, especially when that arrogance comes with wealth and influence. Most people would have stayed quiet. But you didn't. You acted with dignity." Emily blinked, her throat tightening. She had expected anger, maybe even punishment, but not this. Not praise. Around her, guests nodded in agreement, their earlier fear shifting into admiration. Jason shook his head furiously. "Father, you can't be serious. She's just a waitress. You're praising her instead of me." His father's gaze snapped back to him. "And what are you, Jason? A man who insults hardworking people to impress his friends? A man who believes money gives him the right to disrespect others? No. You have embarrassed yourself tonight, not her." The silence that followed was crushing for Jason. His friends shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing they could disappear. The guests at nearby tables exchanged looks of approval, and a few even smiled at Emily. She felt her chest rise with relief, though her hands still trembled slightly from the intensity of it all. The older man straightened, his eyes once again on Emily. "My son still has much to learn," he said. "But you remind me of something important. Integrity. Bravery. Qualities that cannot be bought." Emily's lips parted, but she couldn't find words. She had never imagined someone so powerful would speak to her in this way. She wasn't sure what to say, so she simply nodded, her eyes glistening slightly. Jason stood frozen, his pride shattered, his father's words echoing in his head. For once in his life, he had no clever reply. He looked smaller, almost childlike, as if the weight of his father's disappointment was too heavy to bear. The restaurant remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of awe, of witnessing something rare and unexpected. Emily had thought the night would end with punishment. Instead, it had turned into a lesson not just for Jason, but for everyone watching. And yet, deep inside, Emily knew this was not the end. The older man's words were powerful, yes, but there was something more in his eyes, something unspoken, as if he had plans beyond just scolding his son. Plans that might involve her. The rooftop was still heavy with silence, but now the tension had shifted. It wasn't about Emily anymore, it was about Jason and his father. The young billionaire stood with his jaw tight, his fists clenched, glaring at his father as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. For the first time in his life, Jason had been publicly corrected. And not by a stranger, but by his own father. The older man, calm and composed, stood tall, his sharp eyes locked on his son. The city lights sparkled behind him, the helicopter still waiting on the pad, but his voice carried louder than anything else. "You think respect can be demanded, Jason," his father said firmly, "but true respect must be earned." Jason's face burned red. I am respected. People know who I am. They know the Miller name. Everywhere I go, they treat me like royalty. Isn't that enough? His voice cracked, part anger, part desperation. His father shook his head slowly. They don't respect you, Jason. They fear the money. They fear the power. That is not the same. Tonight, when this young woman stood against you, what did you feel? Did you feel admired? No. You felt exposed. Because deep inside, you know she was right, and you were wrong. The words hit Jason like a heavy blow. His lips trembled, but pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. You're taking her side over me. Over your own son. She's just a waitress. How can she matter more than your blood? Emily's heart raced at those words. She hadn't wanted to be caught in a battle between father and son, but there she was, standing in the middle of it. She lowered her eyes briefly, wishing she could disappear, yet something inside her also felt strong because, for once, the truth was on her side. The older man turned his gaze toward Emily, then back at Jason. His voice lowered, but every word was sharp. She matters because she has what you lack: humility, strength, and courage. Qualities no wealth can buy. I would rather stand beside a stranger who has character than a son who has lost his way. Gasps moved through the restaurant. Guests leaned closer, unable to look away. For them, this was no longer just a family argument, it was a story unfolding before their very eyes. Some even whispered to each other, nodding in agreement with the father's words. Jason's pride snapped. He stepped closer, his voice rising. You're humiliating me. In front of everyone. You don't know what it's like, living in your shadow, always being compared to your success. Maybe I act out, maybe I flaunt my money, but at least I'm not invisible. His chest heaved with each word. The father's face softened slightly. For the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only disappointment mixed with sorrow. Jason, he said quietly, you are not invisible. You are my son. But being my son comes with responsibility. You've been given every advantage, every chance, and yet you use it to tear people down instead of lifting them up. Do you think power means making others feel small? Real power is when you can stand tall without crushing others beneath you. Jason's eyes darted around the restaurant. He saw the guests watching, the waiters frozen, his own friends whispering at the edge of the terrace. He felt cornered, like the walls were closing in. His pride screamed for him to fight back, but another part of him, a quieter part, felt the sting of truth in his father's words. Emily noticed it. For a brief second, Jason's face softened, almost vulnerable, before his pride pushed it away again. He clenched his fists tighter, shaking his head. I don't need a lecture. I don't need anyone to tell me how to live my life. His father straightened, his voice now steady and final. Then you will learn the hard way. But remember this night, Jason. Remember how a waitress showed more strength than you did. And remember that it was not your money, not your name, and not your arrogance that silenced this room, it was her courage. The words hung in the air like a judgment carved in stone. Jason opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. His pride wouldn't let him bow down, yet his heart couldn't fight back. He turned away sharply, his shoulders stiff, his face pale with fury. The father let out a slow breath, then turned to Emily once more. His voice softened again, carrying warmth this time. I apologize for my son's behavior, he said sincerely. You deserved none of it. In fact, you deserve more than an apology. Emily's lips parted, but she couldn't speak. Her chest tightened, overwhelmed by the weight of his words and the intensity of the moment. She had started this shift like any other, taking orders, serving food, cleaning tables, and now she was standing before one of the most powerful men she had ever met, hearing him speak words she could hardly believe. The guests began to murmur, some even clapping softly. Daniel, the young waiter, looked at Emily with admiration, his earlier fear replaced with pride. Emily felt her face warm, not from embarrassment, but from something else, a spark of confidence she hadn't felt in years. Jason, meanwhile, stood in the corner, his pride wounded, his anger simmering. But for once, he had no victory. His father's words had left him powerless. The battle was over, and everyone knew who had won. Yet Emily sensed that this was not the true end. The father's eyes still carried something unspoken, a decision waiting to be revealed. She could feel it building, like the quiet before a storm, like the moment right before the next chapter of her life would unfold. The rooftop was filled with a strange mix of silence and whispers. The argument between Jason and his father had ended, but the air still felt heavy. Guests sat frozen, waiters stood stiff, and the helicopter's faint hum in the background reminded everyone that this was no ordinary night. Emily felt her heart pounding. She had stood her ground, she had spoken the truth, and she had faced both Jason and his father without breaking. But what came next was something she could never have imagined. The older man took a slow breath and then turned back toward Emily. His eyes softened, the sharpness replaced with something deeper, respect. He stepped closer, and this time, his voice was no longer stern or heavy. It carried warmth, sincerity, and even a trace of admiration. "Young lady," he said, "tonight you showed courage. You stood for what is right, even when it meant standing alone. That is rare. Very rare." Emily blinked, unsure how to respond. She gripped her notepad tighter, her fingers trembling. All she could manage was a quiet, "I only did my job, sir." But the man shook his head. "No." Many people would have looked away. Many would have ignored the insults, just to avoid trouble. But you, he paused, letting his words settle in the air, you chose dignity over silence. That kind of strength is what the world needs. A murmur ran through the restaurant. Guests nodded, some even clapped softly again. Emily's chest tightened with emotion. She had never thought of herself as strong, just as someone trying to survive, to make ends meet, to do what was right when it counted. Hearing those words felt surreal. Jason, standing to the side, rolled his eyes, his pride still burning. But he stayed quiet, knowing his father's decision was final. Then came the moment no one expected. The older man straightened, his voice rising just enough for everyone to hear. "Emily," he said, using her name as if he had known it all along, "I want to make you an offer." Emily's brows furrowed in confusion. "An offer," she repeated softly. "Yes," he said firmly. "You do not belong hidden behind trays and menus. You belong in places where your courage can make a difference. I have a position open, by my side. I am looking for someone I can trust, someone who is not blinded by wealth or power. Tonight, you proved that you are exactly that person." The restaurant gasped. The words hung in the air like lightning. Emily felt her knees weaken, and she had to steady herself against the wall. Was he serious? Was this powerful man, Jason's father, offering her a place in his world? She shook her head quickly, overwhelmed. "Sir, I don't understand. I'm just a waitress. I don't have experience with business or big things like that. I only know how to serve tables, take care of people, and keep calm when things get hard." The man smiled faintly. "And that is exactly why I trust you. Skills can be taught. Experience can be gained. But character is rare. I can teach you everything you need to know. But no one can teach what you already carry inside: honesty, courage, and heart." Emily's throat tightened. She thought about her small apartment, the bills waiting on her kitchen counter, the long shifts that left her exhausted but barely paid enough. She thought about her dreams, the ones she had pushed away because life never gave her the chance. And now, here was a man, one of the most powerful men she had ever met, offering her a chance to step into a completely different life. Her manager stood nearby, his mouth open in shock. Daniel, the young waiter, stared at her with wide eyes filled with pride. The guests looked at her as though she had already transformed before their eyes, from a simple waitress to someone extraordinary. Emily's lips trembled. "Why me?" she whispered. The man's answer was simple. "Because you reminded me of something I had forgotten. Power is nothing without integrity. And tonight, you gave me hope." For a long moment, Emily stood frozen. Her mind raced. Could she really leave everything she knew behind and step into a world of helicopters, wealth, and influence? Could a waitress truly walk into the life of a billionaire's trusted ally? Her heart whispered that this was more than just an opportunity, it was destiny. The man extended his hand toward her. "What do you say, Emily? Will you join me?" Time seemed to stop. Jason shifted uncomfortably, his pride wounded deeper with every passing second. He had called his father to destroy Emily, but instead, his father was lifting her higher than she ever imagined. It was the ultimate twist of fate. Emily slowly reached out her hand. Her fingers trembled as they touched his, but when their hands shook, the trembling faded. Strength replaced fear. She realized she wasn't just saying yes to a job, she was saying yes to a new life. "I'll do my best," she said softly, but with firm resolve. The man nodded. "That is all I ask." Applause broke out across the restaurant. Guests clapped, some even stood, cheering softly for the young waitress who had stood up against arrogance and walked away with dignity and something more. Daniel's eyes shone with tears, and even Emily's manager, though still shocked, smiled with pride. Jason turned away, his jaw tight, his pride shattered. He had lost more than an argument, he had lost the respect of his father, and the spotlight he had always craved now belonged to someone he had tried to humiliate. The helicopter's blades began to spin again, the wind swirling across the rooftop. The older man gestured toward it. "Come," he said kindly. "It is time for you to see the world from above." Emily glanced once more at the restaurant, at the life she was leaving behind. Then she took a deep breath and stepped toward the helicopter. The wind rushed against her face, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. As she climbed aboard, the city stretched out below her, glittering like 1,000 stars. The helicopter lifted off, carrying her into the unknown, into a future she had never dared to dream of. And in that moment, Emily realized something. Sometimes, life changes not in quiet steps, but in sudden leaps when courage meets opportunity, and an ordinary night becomes the beginning of an extraordinary journey.